The First World War is often remembered in images of trenches and artillery, of mud and loss on the Western Front. But before the armies clashed in Flanders or Galicia, the shockwaves of war struck the financial world with equal force. When the guns of August roared, the first casualty was not a soldier in Belgium, but the markets in London and New York. On July 31st, 1914, the London Stock Exchange closed its doors. It had not done so in its history, not even during earlier wars. The panic was immediate and contagious. Within days, nearly every major exchange in the world, from Paris to Berlin, from Vienna to New York, shut down. The fear was simple and brutal. Investors holding foreign securities, Russian bonds in London, French renters in Berlin, German loans in Paris began to dump them en masse. Prices collapsed. British consols, once the safest investment in the world, plummeted. As one Times of London editorial observed that week, the panic has been extraordinary in its violence and rapidity. Governments scrambled. In London, the Bank of England doubled its discount rate from 3% to 6% overnight, a desperate attempt to keep gold from fleeing the country. The Treasury announced a moratorium on bills of exchange, suspending the very machinery of global trade finance. Bankers feared a full-blown run on the banks, not unlike the great crises of the 19th century. The United States was hit as well. On July 31st, the New York Stock Exchange also suspended trading, and it would remain closed for more than 4 months until December 12, 1914. It was the longest shutdown in Wall Street's history. Secretary of the Treasury William McAdoo later recalled the tension in Washington. "We were confronted with the prospect of an appalling financial panic, one that would have eclipsed all previous panics. His solution was equally extraordinary. He ordered the Treasury to flood the system with emergency currency using powers from the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, printing nearly $400 million in new notes to keep banks liquid. The suspension worked. By freezing trading and supplying emergency cash, governments bought themselves time. But the signal was unmistakable. The First World War began not on the battlefield, but in the balance sheets of bankers. Before a single trench was dug, the financial system had nearly collapsed. To understand how the Great War could last more than 4 years, you must follow the money. It is here, in the counting houses of London, the vaults of Berlin, and the offices of New York, that the real endurance test was staged. The armies could march only as long as the bankers allowed them. By the close of 1915, Britain had spent more than £370 million. But to leave it at that number is to miss the anatomy of the war machine. Where, precisely, did that money go? Roughly £200 million was devoured by the War Office. Rifles, artillery shells, uniforms, and the logistics to supply a 1,000,000-man army in France. The Admiralty accounted for nearly £150 million, keeping the Royal Navy supreme at sea, building new dreadnoughts and paying the crews who enforced the blockade of Germany. Civil ministries, swollen by emergency measures, consumed the rest. Yet Britain's greatest hidden expense was not military hardware, but finance itself. Subsidies poured out of London to keep allies in the field. Russia received more than £65 million in credits during the first year alone. France, though richer, still leaned heavily on British Treasury advances to buy raw materials and pay for shipping. These were not gifts, they were loans, with the expectation of repayment, but repayment hinged on an Allied victory. All the while, Britain's trade deficit ballooned. In 1914, imports exceeded exports by £75 million. By 1915, the deficit had swollen to £350 million. The reason was stark. The country that once fed the world could no longer feed itself in war. Wheat, beef, and above all, munitions, had to be bought from abroad, chiefly from the United States. Paying for this torrent of imports required draining Britain's gold reserves. The Bank of England's holdings of bullion fell dangerously as gold was shipped across the Atlantic to settle accounts. For investors, this was the real story. The invisible hemorrhage of capital. Britain was still the richest country in Europe, but the balance sheet was deteriorating by the month. Each bond issue, each fresh borrowing, was a wager that the war would end before the Treasury's coffers ran dry. As the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Reginald McKenna, warned Parliament in late 1915, "We are borrowing on a scale never contemplated before. It is the spirit of the people that sustains us now, but it is the credit of the nation that must carry us to the end." Germany faced the war with fewer financial weapons than Britain. Cut off from global capital markets by the Royal Navy blockade, Berlin had only one option: tap the savings of its own people. The solution was the Kriegsanleihe. These were war loans marketed directly to the German public. Between 1914 and 1918, 9 separate loan drives were launched. In total, they raised more than 100 billion marks. But this was not Wall Street syndication or international borrowing. It was a domestic appeal, a massive transfer of middle-class savings into the hands of the Reich. The campaigns were waged with the tools of propaganda. Posters showed children clutching their fathers as they marched to the front, urging citizens to lend for victory. Churches held special services to encourage subscription. In Berlin, school teachers marched pupils to banks to buy miniature bonds with their pocket money. The appeal was not only financial, but moral. Lending to the state was equated with serving in the trenches. The terms were, on paper, enticing. The first loan in September 1914 offered a 5% interest rate, far higher than pre-war government securities. Each successive issue promised similar yields. By the 8th loan in 1918, the Reich was desperate, offering terms it could scarcely hope to honor. The bonds sold anyway, because refusal carried the taint of disloyalty. Yet beneath the patriotic veneer, the scheme was perilous. These loans were not backed by gold or foreign reserves. They were backed only by the Reich's ability to win the war. When Germany lost, the bonds collapsed in value. Middle-class families who had emptied savings accounts in good faith found themselves holding paper worth a fraction of its face value. The Reich's gamble was clear: buy time with borrowed marks, and hope victory would erase the debt. But investors should have seen the risk. By 1917, with starvation spreading due to the blockade and military setbacks mounting, repayment was a fantasy. Still, the loans continued. Economists later called it a voluntary confiscation of savings. For today's investor, the lesson is hauntingly familiar. Lending to a state on the brink of collapse is like buying junk bonds from a company circling bankruptcy. The promised yield may dazzle, but the underlying asset is rotten. In Germany's case, millions of families learned this lesson the hard way. They did not merely lose money, they lost faith in their institutions, a bitterness that would echo through the Weimar years and beyond. As the Frankfurter Zeitung observed in November 1918, with the empire collapsing, "The bonds we clasp are now relics of trust betrayed. We lent our money for victory. What we hold now is proof of defeat." If Germany relied on its own people, Britain and France had a lifeline across the Atlantic. That lifeline was stitched together not by governments, but by bankers. And at the center stood J.P. Morgan Co. By early 1915, the strain on Britain's finances was visible. Gold reserves were thinning, imports were skyrocketing, and London needed American credit to survive. But President Woodrow Wilson had declared the United States neutral. How then could the Allies raise money in New York without dragging Washington into the war? The answer was to cloak politics in finance. Britain quietly appointed J.P. Morgan Co. as its official purchasing agent in America. The firm would not only buy munitions, food, and raw materials on Britain's behalf, it would also raise the cash to pay for them. As one Morgan partner later recalled, it was a transaction not of sentiment, but of business. The first great test came in September 1915. Britain and France needed an enormous loan to cover spiraling costs. The figure settled on was $500 million at that time, the largest foreign loan ever floated in the United States. To pull it off, J.P. Morgan organized a syndicate of some 130 American banks and trust companies. The deal was launched with fanfare. The securities carried a 5% interest rate, payable in gold, with maturities of 5 years. Collateral was pledged in the form of British and French government obligations. The appeal to investors was clear: high yield, solid government backing, and the prestige of Morgan underwriting. Within hours, subscriptions poured in. The issue was heavily oversubscribed. Wall Street had spoken, and it had spoken in favor of the Allies. The sums tell the story. By the end of 1916, Morgan's syndicate had arranged loans totaling more than $2 billion to Britain and France. These dollars purchased everything from artillery shells to locomotives, from wheat to uniforms. Every bullet fired by an Allied soldier had a trace of American finance behind it. This was more than just banking. It was leverage. By holding the purse strings, Morgan and his circle wielded influence over entire governments. Britain's ability to wage war became entangled with the willingness of New York bankers to extend credit. Wall Street had become a silent partner in the Allied cause. Critics at the time saw the danger. Senator Robert La Follette thundered in Congress that the House of Morgan is not only the fiscal agent of the Allies, it is fast becoming their government in America. Others warned that financial entanglement would drag the United States into the conflict regardless of Wilson's neutrality. They were not entirely wrong, By the time America formally declared war in April 1917, its financial institutions had already picked a side. The Anglo-French loan of 1915 thus marked a turning point. It was not only the largest loan of its age, it was a signal that global financial supremacy was shifting. London might remain the world's financial capital in name, but the future belonged to Wall Street. Consider the arithmetic of war. By 1917, Britain's daily expenditure reached nearly £7 million. Every 24 hours, the equivalent of a medium-sized bank vanished into the maw of the war machine. To sustain this, the government issued an endless stream of war bonds. Posters urged citizens to lend to defend the right. By war's end, Britain's national debt had increased more than tenfold, from under £700 million in 1914 to over £7 billion in 1918. The investors who bought those bonds believed they were making a patriotic sacrifice, yet they also expected a return. 5% war loans were common, offering handsome interest compared to pre-war government securities. In this way, ordinary citizens became both financiers of the slaughter and creditors of the state. Suspense thickens when we see how this money power shifted the balance of the world. Germany, cut off by the Royal Navy's blockade, could not access New York's markets. Its bonds remained confined to Berlin and Vienna. Britain, by contrast, fed on American dollars. By April 1917, when the United States entered the war, the financial link had already forged a de facto alliance. Wall Street had chosen sides before Washington did. Niall Ferguson argues this financial imbalance was decisive. Wars are not only won on the battlefield, they are won in the bond market. A nation that cannot pay its soldiers, import its grain, or purchase its artillery is a nation that cannot win. The Allies endured, and Germany collapsed, not only because of generals and strategies, but because of bankers and capital flows. And yet, this financing carried its own curse. The colossal debts would haunt Europe long after the armistice. Britain emerged, technically victorious, but financially broken, shackled to Wall Street. The war had transferred the mantle of financial supremacy from London to New York. America, once the world's debtor, had become its creditor. The story is chilling because it echoes. When you buy a government bond today, you step into this lineage. You're lending to the state in its moment of need, just as British citizens did in 1915, or as American investors did when they bought Liberty bonds after their country entered the war. But here's the question that should keep any investor awake at night. When wars are financed by private capital, who truly decides the fate of nations? Was the First World War prolonged not simply by generals in Flanders, but by bankers in New York who kept writing the checks? That is the hidden battle Ferguson pointed to. Not fought with bayonets and shells, but with loans and interest rates. A battle that determined not only who won the war, but who ruled global finance afterward. So the next time you hear of sovereign bonds, remember this. Once, these instruments were as lethal as artillery. They could keep an army in the field, or leave it to starve. The investors who bankrolled World War I were not soldiers, but their signatures on contracts altered history.